Hi everyone, it's Kelly here. Welcome if this is your first time and welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you either way. Today I am wrapping up my reading for the month of September. I'm filming this on the 28th of September, so it's actually not quite the end. So there is the possibility that I will read another book in the last couple of days. However, I am traveling on the 30th to a holiday, so I wanted to get in and get this recorded so that I could have something ready to pop up onto my channel. So the 28th. So there is still the possibility that there's more to come, but I'll just include those in my October wrap up. All right, so this month so far I have read 7 books. Most of them, actually, is there a most? The first 3 of them were audiobooks, so that was definitely something. And then 2 others, at least another one is also an audiobook. So, and one I started on audiobook and then moved across. So it's been a bit of an audiobook month for me. And but I also have a few books to show you as well. So let's get straight into it. The first book was Luster by Leilani. I loved this book. I listened to it on audio. I think I will reread this book as a physical book, and I have it. I own it, so I'll be able to do that. So yeah, the writing is just glorious in this book. It's absolutely glorious, and although it's more of a character-driven novel, and also one where we're hearing the sort of the mental processing of the protagonist, the pacing was actually quite decent. So things kind of move along at a decent pace in this book, which sometimes when you have a character-driven novel, that's not the case, but it is for this one. So our protagonist is called Edie, and she is a Black woman working in an industry that is dominated by white people, and she engages in a lot of sex with her colleagues and other people, but she really is struggling, I think, with making genuine connections with people. So she's young, and she's, this is just sort of how she's navigating the world. And then she meets an older man who is married, but his wife has given him permission to date / have sex with someone else under certain parameters. So that becomes very complicated, this relationship, because there's sort of attachment there, and it's not an easy situation to navigate. And then there just comes this point where things just really go very weird, and she gets much more involved with his actual family in an unexpected way. So it's tricky. And one of the things that I actually really liked about this book was the relationship between Edie and the wife of her lover. It was a really obviously complicated relationship, but the evolution of it and sort of how both women are kind of processing things, I found really fascinating to read. There are some uncomfortable parts of this book. So domestic violence, miscarriage, racial profiling by the police. There are things that happen in this book that may be a lot for people who have those things as triggers. So just a warning on that one. But overall, it just was a really, the beautiful moments that kind of came through, as well as just kind of like the complicated situation that arises and how everybody kind of navigates that situation is what really carried this book for me, I think. Yeah, I think it's going to sit with me for a long time, and I definitely want to reread it at some point. So yeah, highly recommend. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. So that's Luster by Raven Leilani. So that was book number 1, and I finished that one quite early on in the month, maybe on the 2nd or so. And then I picked up another audiobook when I finished that one called After Story by Larissa Behrendt. I don't have a copy of that one to show you. But I really also enjoyed this book as well. It's, again, a character-driven book, which I think is more my preference in terms of my reading style. I really do like a character-driven book. So definitely it kind of played into my wheelhouse, I guess you could say. So what I like about character-driven books is kind of like the subtle shifts in the relationship between characters and how they're kind of, again, how they're processing things and how they're kind of working through what's happening. So in this book, we have 2 characters, Della and Jasmine, and we alternate their perspectives. Again, that's something else I really like in books, is a dual narrator, and they are mother and daughter. Their relationship at the beginning of the book, they are not estranged exactly, but Jasmine has kind of moved away and is trying to distance herself, I guess, from her family. And the reason for that is that when Jasmine was very young, one of her sisters disappeared, and it sort of shifted their family dynamics. What I haven't mentioned is that these characters are Australian Aboriginal characters, and so there are elements in this book, very kind of gentle, I would say, but elements of talking about the complexity of the lives of Aboriginal people in the modern day, and some assumptions that get made and racism, everyday sort of racism that they come across. But the focus, though, is that these 2 characters, who are not exactly estranged, but whose relationship can be rocky at times, go on a trip together to England, and it's a literary trip. So Jasmine is somebody who has, who found her solace in books and reading. And her mother, Della, is not so much of a reader, but she's just excited to kind of come along and to spend time with her daughter. And sort of as they go on this tour, and it's a sort of a guided tour, so you meet the tour guide, you meet other people on the tour, and sort of have the, events happen because of the dynamics of the group of people on the tour and so on. And that I loved that, like, they were great characters, these other people on the tour, and also just like from the different perspectives, like how Jasmine kind of views her mother and the reverse as well, and the way that Jasmine views her mother versus her mother's own kind of talking through of what's happened was also really, really interesting, because they were quite sort of different, the perception and then Della's own kind of experience of things. So that was really, really interesting. There were some moments in this book where the writing pulled me out of my absorption in the story. So it felt sometimes like the writer had too much to say and hadn't allowed herself to edit it out. And also there was a couple of spoilers in there for some classics. Now, I know classics were written a very, very long time ago, but there are certain classics that I would like to read and have not yet read. For example, Jane Eyre. I don't know why I haven't read it yet, but I haven't. And there was a spoiler in there for Jane Eyre, and also for Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is another classic that I was planning on reading. So that was a bit disappointing, because I don't think it was necessary. But there were those spoilers. So yeah, that was a bit disappointing. But all in all, this was a great book, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars, and is definitely something that I would be interested in rereading at some point, because it was a really great story. The next one that I read was The Poet X by Elizabeth, I should have looked up how to say the last name, Acevedo. I probably said that completely wrong. I'm so sorry. And this actually turned out to be book 52. So my my reading goal in terms of the number of books that I would like to read this year was 52, one book for each week of the year, and I hit that goal when I finished this book. And it was a great one to finish on because it was a 5-star read for me. Now, I've actually been plugging away at this as an audiobook for some time. So I just kind of did that final push. You know, when you sort of, I don't know if other people have this experience when they're reading an audiobook where you sort of just get to a tipping point and then you just make the time. Like I'd been sort of reading it in little chunks, sort of listening to a little bit. And then I reached the tipping point in the story where I was like, I just need to know how this kind of pans out. So then I just did the push and listened to the last, 2 hours or so in one sitting, basically. So yeah, that was, it was really, really enjoyable. And I also cried all through maybe the last third of this book. Yeah. So this is a verse novel. I would say it's possibly YA. So the characters are in high school. And our main character, Xiomara, is so she's a high school student, and basically she comes from a family where her mother is incredibly Catholic and her father is quite distant. She has a twin brother who is treated very differently to her. He's sort of idolized, I guess, by the parents in some way. And so there's sort of that the family dynamic aspect of things that makes this an interesting place to begin. And then she ends up, through her English teacher, getting into poetry. And in all other aspects of her life, she sort of is somebody who feels like she has to be tough and to be not someone that she isn't, but to sort of have to present a persona, I guess, of herself, as opposed to authentically being able to be herself. So through poetry, she finds a way that she can be herself and that she can talk, can express what's going on inside her brain and in her heart, and in an unfiltered way, I guess. So yeah, it's sort of about growing up and, the changes that happen to you when you're in high school. But it's also this kind of just the healing power of expressing yourself, I guess, and particularly through poetry. And that, it's a verse novel, so it's sort of written in poetic verse, which I always quite enjoy when I've read in the past. And I felt like this is a book that has a lot of heart, and the characters are really three-dimensional. You really kind of get to know Xiomara and also her, her family and the people that she sort of comes across through poetry, and also this kind of budding romance that she has with a boy at her school. So yeah, it's just it was a really lovely book, and I would highly recommend it. It's beautiful, and is definitely not just for young people. I'm an old person, so I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I would highly recommend. Okay, then we get on to a book that I was supposed to finish last month but didn't quite get through, and that is The Man Who Spoke Snakeish by Andrus Kivirahk. So we read this book as part of my around the world reading challenge, which I mention every month because I'm reading a different book from a different country each month. This was one from Estonia, and I really enjoyed this, but not everybody in my book club did. So this was so we follow first of all a boy and then a man called Limet, and he is recounting his life, and he's sort of, the last person who speaks Snakish, as in can speak to snakes and other animals that understand Snakish. He lives in a traditional sort of hunter-gatherer, in that kind of lifestyle in the forest, with his mother and his sister. And he's taught by his uncle to speak Snakish, and even has a best buddy who is a snake, and called Ince. And Ince is a great character in this book. But times are changing, and most people are moving out of the forest into a sort of little town, or village, I guess you probably would be how you more accurately describe it. And there's sort of this kind of, it's the coming of, they call them the Iron Men, as in the men who are coming as in iron armor. And they are, and also the monks come as well. So there's changing religion, there's changing lifestyles, moving from that hunter-gatherer type of life to a farming kind of life, and the changes that sort of come with that, at being at that sort of pivotal moment where things are changing in a society. Yeah, at times this is quite a brutal book, and this book does not hold back on the gore. There's a lot of, literal heads rolling, a lot of blood, a lot of guts. It's quite gross at times. So if that's something that, if you're squeamish about that sort of thing, this book is not for you. But this is a very odd book as well. And so it's, obviously because you've got a character who's speaking to snakes, and you're kind of getting his like unfiltered thoughts about things. And, he's a boy growing into a man. So you get his unfiltered thoughts about, of things that you would expect teenage boys to be thinking about as he's going through that part of his life. It's kind of coming into his manhood. So there's fat phobia in this book that I was not a massive fan of, and just a general tendency to comment on women's bodies, which I guess is makes sense in the context of it being about a teenage boy through part of the book who is thinking about women's bodies, but it also was just kind of like it was a little bit grating, I will say. Yeah, and particularly like looking at the flaws of women, like why this particular woman is the way that she is, which I didn't appreciate. But other than that, this was a really enjoyable, quirky read. So I ended up giving it 4.25 stars, and I enjoyed it. I think it's a really interesting book and not something that I have read before. So really cool. All right, so now we are back to more Australian content. I've already spoken about After Story, which is one of the books that was nominated for the Miles Franklin Award, which is a challenge. I'm trying to read through all of the nominees for the Miles Franklin Award. This was not one that made the shortlist, but I very much enjoyed reading through that one. The other Australian books that I'm reading at the moment are I set up an Australian reading challenge, which I'll link to in the description below. And I read a book that met a prompt for that. It's also meeting a prompt for my classic reading classics, and I also did it as a buddy read with somebody. So that is Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. So this is an Australian classic, a book that was written, I think, back in the, I want to say 60s or 70s. I'm sure when I was speaking about this before, I mentioned it. Yes, 1967 it was published, and it has sort of become part of our sort of literary canon here in Australia. And it's about a group of schoolgirls who go on a picnic as part of a kind of like a school excursion, I guess you would say, at a place called Hanging Rock, which is a real feature in Victoria, I want to say, which is a part of Australia. And I pointed down as I was saying that because I live in New South Wales and Victoria is below us on the map. So down in Victoria. And essentially it's just a really interesting rock feature, but Joan Lindsay kind of imagines it as creates this mystery. So the girls are all together going on a picnic, and some of the older girls, with permission from their teachers, go off to kind of investigate the rock a little bit more closely. This, I should say as well, this is kind of set at I'm going to say the turn of the century. So they're in kind of like real Victorian style, full dresses and petticoats and all the rest. So they're not really dressed for rock climbing per se. Anyway, they go missing, and this happens. That's kind of like the big, the central kind of thing of the book. And then it's kind of about the exploration of, trying to find out what happened to them, trying to find them to see if, did any of them survive, and so on. And so, yeah, we get the perspective of a couple of different people in this book. So at the beginning of the book, before the girls disappear, we get their perspective on things, and, sort of what happens to a point as they kind of head towards the rock. And we sort of get the beginnings of what happens to them. But then we don't find out straight away, it's a mystery. Now, I will say that there were, at the beginning of the book, it took a little bit for me to get into it, because it opens at their school, which is called Appleyard College, and it's kind of this private school situation. And even in the book, they're sort of saying, like, the person who runs the school has never run a school before. She doesn't have an educational background necessarily. So it's kind of interesting to kind of like know about how girls' private schools kind of happened. I'm assuming that that's based on some kind of reality of how things were. So, basically rich people send their daughters to this school, paying exorbitant fees for their children's education. But it's like a boarding school kind of situation. And then, and they're in the country and so on. And then, so that bit is, I would say there's a lot of characters that are introduced at that point. They're talking about the girls. Some of the girls are really insufferable, and I really refuse to believe that at any time that girls have been that insufferable, even in history, as some of the boarders that are there at Appleyard College. Also, one of the other things, so that was a bit tricky to kind of get into. But then once the mystery occurs, so it takes a couple of chapters, but the mystery occurs, and then we start to move into the perspective of Mike, who is the son of the nephew of wealthy landowners at that time, and he has just moved to Australia, and he's at this time with his aunt and uncle. So they were also picnicking at Hanging Rock. So that's how he gets involved in the mystery. And then Albert as well, who is their kind of coachman, their horseman, who's with them as well. So once we kind of get into their perspectives, it gets more interesting, I think. And there were twists that happen at the end that I was not expecting, and of course the conclusion of the story was not necessarily expected for me. So that was interesting. I did get into it as we went on. However, because I was listening to this on audiobook, and my husband kept walking in and out because I had it on speaker while I was doing other things, and he's just like, wow, they are really going to town on saying the words picnic and Hanging Rock a lot, and it's true. Like they mention in this book the word picnic and the words Hanging Rock are mentioned so many times, it's kind of ridiculous. So there are aspects of this book that are kind of not as good as I would have hoped. But overall, this was an interesting read. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I don't think I'm going to reread this book again, but as it's part of our literary canon, and also as it's part of our kind of historical literary sort of the basis of our literary culture in Australia, I'm glad that I have read it for that reason. So that's Picnic at Hanging Rock. Then I started out on audiobook, but then moved to the Kindle because there was a problem with the audiobook, and bits of the book were skipping. And I knew that because this is a reread for me. I read Too Much Lip by Melissa Lucashenko. And so this was a reread, as I said, and I read most of it on my Kindle on ebook. So it was still an enjoyable, so I enjoyed it the first time I read it, and it was still enjoyable for me reading it through a second time. I remembered so many of the twists and turns of the story. However, I think the main character, Kerry, is such a great character that it kind of carries, even if you know what's coming, it still kind of carries the story and makes it continue to be interesting. I also really loved her, the cast of characters. So Kerry's family and beyond as well. So this is a very, they're all very readable kind of characters. So let me give you a quick synopsis of what happens. So we've got Kerry Salter, who is an Aboriginal Australian, and she comes from a small country town called Durongo, which I believe is made up. I don't think it's a real place. And she has moved to, is in New South Wales. So it's sort of a country town in the north of New South Wales, which is the state in which I live. And she has moved, though, to Queensland, but she's called back to visit her family. She usually only visits at Christmas time, but she has been called back to visit because her her grandfather, is dying, and she's, been told come because we're nearing the end. So it's, important for you to come and visit. So she does that, but she's very she doesn't feel comfortable being there. Her family is quite complicated and has, again, a sister who's gone missing. So that's a bit odd. That I've read 2 books about Aboriginal Australians where a sister has gone missing. So yeah, her sister had gone missing, like 20 years ago. And so now she's come back, as in Kerry has come back and is, visiting with her complicated family. She's got a brother who is pretty rough. He sort of sees himself as the head of the family and is kind of like but he can be quite volatile. He drinks and can be, sometimes you get a genial kind of character, and then other times he's quite violent and, you don't know how things are going to go. So everybody's kind of always on edge around him. And then you've also got a mother who has kind of found religion, and that's an interesting kind of dynamic as well. Because it sits alongside, she also reads the tarot. So it's kind of like this really interesting juxtaposition of, she's become religious, but she's also kind of held to other things, and she still, has the vibes and so on about things. So, she's a really interesting character. And then you've got the grandfather, of course, as well, and who has lived a very difficult life, and as a result, aspects of his personality are the way they are. So yeah, we've got this really complicated family situation, and it's sort of just, I won't say more about the plot because I think it's just kind of fun to let it reveal itself, and also that there's some heavy stuff that kind of comes out as the book goes on, but it's a really good book. I really enjoyed it the second time through, and I kept my rating that I had on it before, which was 4.5 stars. So yeah, I'm glad that I've reread it, and so we read this actually for my book club for around the world for this month. So I caught up on last month's one, read this month's one, because our country this month is Australia, which I was very, very excited about. So I'm looking forward to having the chat with my book club in a week or two about this book, and hopefully being able to give some extra insight, given that I come from Australia and have a bit of background knowledge that others might not have. So yeah, this is it was a great read, and I would still recommend this book. The last book that I read so far for this month is Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. So again, another Australian classic. Within this edition, there are 3 stories, which is, I think, the complete adventures of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. So it's all of the May Gibbs books that these 2 characters turn up in. So it's Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, Little Ragged Blossom, and Little Obelia. So if you are not aware, again, this is from our literary canon. These were children's books that were written back, I think this edition was published in, not this edition, but the collected stories were first published in 1940. So this is from a long time ago, and it is, again, part of our literary canon and part of our history in a literary way. So again, I was very glad to have read these books and these stories. They were something else. So they were probably the most fast-paced adventure story I've ever read in my life. Literally something happens, and then that part concludes, and then straight away something else terrible happens as well. And for a children's book, there were a lot of murderous plans afoot. So yeah, like it was quite violent. There was a lot of death of animals and characters of good and bad character. So yeah, it was definitely of its time. But I can see how at that time, before everybody had access to TV and other forms of entertainment that were as, readily available in your own house, I can see how this story would have been really engaging for children at that time. I think comparing it to children's literature of today, it is definitely dated and is not in the style that children of today would be used to reading. But I think it's important to read because it is part of our Australian history and, for the cultural references alone. And I also have picked up a word that I'm going to start using, which is deady bones, to mean dead. And also some of the characters, and I'll see if I can just flick through and find an example of one. So we have a tree here in Australia called a banksia tree, and the seed pods from that tree. So what I should say actually is that a lot of these characters are based on like Australian flora. So basically we've got these are gumnut babies. So gum nuts are again the seeds for for gum trees. She's kind of like imagined them as little characters. And then the bad characters are the banksia seed pods, which look something like this. I'll see if I can find a picture and I'll pop it in as well. So that you can see what they look like if you're not from here. So she kind of imagines these as the bad guys. And I have always called them, so in the story they're bad. So they're the big bad Banksia men. And I've always called those seed pods big bad Banksia men whenever I see them on the ground or in a tree, which I've just been traveling to a place called Pearl Beach, and there are a lot of Banksia trees there. So I was like, oh, big bad Banksia men. And there's heaps of them in the trees at the moment. So yeah, I will continue to do that now until I am daddy bones for the rest of my life. So they will always be big bad Banksia men to me. But yeah, I did give this 3 stars. It's not something that I plan on revisiting. I started reading this to my niece, and then I First of all, she's a bit young. She's only 3. But then I just was like, you know what? We're going to stop reading this now, because it started getting, like, there was a lot of, stuff there that was not really appropriate for 3-year-olds. Like, things dying, people dying, people being in very dangerous situations. So we stopped reading this, and we perhaps will read some other things instead. So yeah, that was Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. 3 stars for me. But again, I was quite glad to have read it. So that's it. That's where I'm up to now for September 2022. I've read 7 books, 4 of which I've got copies of here, and then the 3 that I don't. So yeah, it has been a good reading month for me, and I hope to continue that into October. I've got some plans for what I want to get read next month. So I think I might even make a TBR video, which I don't do every month because my TBR is usually pretty movable. But I'm starting to kind of focus now as we head towards the end of the year. So yeah, I might make one of those as well. So yeah, I will see you on the next one, guys. But thank you for watching and for sticking around. And we'll see you soon. Bye.